I saw my adopted son's photo in a missing child database. He wasn't the only one. I was scrolling through Facebook on a random Thursday evening when I saw the sponsored ad that changed everything. It was one of those help find missing children posts that occasionally pop up in social media feeds, showing photos of kids who'd disappeared over the years. The organization was trying to keep cold cases visible, hoping someone might recognize a face and provide information. I almost scrolled past without looking closely, but something made me pause. The boy in the third row looked exactly like my 8-year-old son Oliver. Same dark hair, same brown eyes, same distinctive dimple on his left cheek. My heart started racing as I stared at the photo, trying to convince myself it was just a coincidence. Kids often look similar, especially at that age. But the resemblance was so striking it made my hands shake as I screenshot the image. The caption underneath read, Vincent Castellano, missing since 2018, age 3 at time of disappearance. My breath caught because Oliver had been 3 when we adopted him through Sunshine Family Services 2 years ago. The agency told us his birth mother was a teenager who couldn't provide proper care and that he'd been in foster care briefly before becoming available for adoption. We'd been trying to have children for 6 years, and Oliver felt like a miracle we'd finally been blessed with. I called my husband Daniel into the living room and showed him the photo without saying anything. His face went white as he looked from the screen to Oliver, who was playing with blocks on the carpet nearby. That's impossible, Daniel whispered, but his voice was shaking. The adoption agency ran background checks. They verified everything. I zoomed in on the missing child poster and found more details that made my stomach drop even further. Vincent had been reported missing from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, which was only 3 hours from our home in Minneapolis. His parents were listed as Maria and Anthony Castellano, and there was a phone number for tips. The physical description matched Oliver perfectly, right down to a small birthmark on his right shoulder that I'd noticed during bath time. According to the poster, Vincent had been playing in his backyard when he disappeared, and despite extensive searches, no trace of him had ever been found. I spent the next hour comparing every detail I could find online about the missing child with what I knew about Oliver's background. The ages lined up perfectly. The physical characteristics were identical, and the timeline of Vincent's disappearance coincided with when Oliver supposedly became available for adoption. My hands were trembling as I called Sunshine Family Services emergency line, but it went straight to voicemail with a message saying the agency was permanently closed due to administrative issues. That night, I couldn't sleep, lying in bed staring at the ceiling while Daniel snored softly beside me. I kept thinking about the adoption process, how smooth everything had been, almost too smooth. Usually adoptions took months or years of waiting, background checks, and home visits. But with Oliver, we'd gotten a call saying a child was available within 2 weeks of submitting our application. The social worker, Patricia Valdez, had been friendly and professional, walking us through all the paperwork and assuring us that Oliver's birth family had voluntarily surrendered their rights. At 3 a.m, I crept into Oliver's room and sat in the chair beside his bed, watching him sleep. His face looked so peaceful and innocent, exactly like the child in that missing poster. I studied every feature, trying to find differences that would prove this was all a horrible coincidence, but the resemblance was undeniable. This beautiful boy we'd been raising as our son might be someone else's child entirely, stolen from parents who'd been searching for him for years. The next morning, I waited until Daniel left for work, and Oliver was at school before calling the phone number on the missing child poster. My hands shook so badly I could barely dial, and when a woman answered, I almost hung up immediately. "Hello, this is Maria Castellano," she said, and her voice sounded tired and sad in a way that broke my heart. I forced myself to speak, explaining that I'd seen the poster and thought I might have information about Vincent. Maria's reaction was immediate and heartbreaking. She started crying and asking rapid-fire questions about where I'd seen him and whether he was safe and healthy. I tried to explain the situation carefully, that we'd adopted a child through an agency that might not have been legitimate, and that our son looked identical to her missing Vincent. She begged me to send photos, and when I did, she called back within minutes, sobbing so hard she could barely speak. "That's my baby," she kept saying. "That's Vincent. Look at that dimple. That's exactly the same. And the birthmark on his shoulder? Did you see the birthmark?" I confirmed that Oliver had the same mark, and Maria broke down completely. She said she'd known he was alive somewhere, had felt it in her heart despite what police told her about most missing children cases. She'd never stopped looking, never stopped hoping, and now she was staring at recent photos of her son living with strangers 3 hours away. I agreed to meet Maria and her husband Anthony at a coffee shop halfway between our cities the next day. The drive felt like the longest 2 hours of my life as I rehearsed what I would say, how I would explain that we'd had no idea we were raising a kidnapped child. Daniel had wanted to come with me, but I felt like I needed to do this alone first, to see if the resemblance was as obvious in person as it was in photographs. I recognized Maria immediately when she walked into the coffee shop, because she had Oliver's same dark eyes and facial structure. Anthony was tall and broad-shouldered, with the same dimple Oliver had inherited. They sat down across from me, both of them visibly nervous and emotional, clutching photos of Vincent from before he disappeared. Maria slid a baby picture across the table that could have been Oliver's newborn photo, and Anthony showed me a video on his phone of Vincent playing in their backyard just days before he vanished. "We've been living in hell for 2 years, Maria said quietly, every day wondering if he's okay, if someone's hurting him, if we'll ever see him again. The police told us that most missing children aren't found alive after the first 48 hours, but I refused to believe Vincent was dead. I could feel that he was out there somewhere, that someone was taking care of him." She wiped tears from her eyes and asked about Oliver's daily routine, what foods he liked, whether he still slept with stuffed animals. Every detail I shared seemed to confirm what they already knew. Oliver loved mac and cheese, which had been Vincent's favorite meal. He was afraid of loud noises, especially thunderstorms, which matched exactly what Maria remembered about her son. He had a habit of humming to himself while he played, something Anthony said Vincent had done since he was a toddler. The behavioral patterns were too specific and consistent to be coincidental. Anthony pulled out his phone and played more videos of Vincent, and I watched my son's identical face laughing and playing in a different backyard with different toys. The voice was the same. The mannerisms were identical, even the way he moved his hands when he got excited. Maria noticed me staring and said gently, "That's your son too now. I can see how much you love him. This isn't your fault, and I don't want you to think we're trying to take him away from the only family he remembers." We talked for 3 hours, sharing stories about Oliver's personality and development, comparing notes about his likes and dislikes. Maria showed me Vincent's medical records, and every scar, every vaccination, every detail matched Oliver's health history that the adoption agency had provided. It became impossible to deny that the child we'd been raising for 2 years was indeed Vincent Castellano, stolen from his loving family and placed with us through what appeared to be an elaborate fraud. I drove home in a daze, my mind racing with questions about how this could have happened and what we were supposed to do now. Oliver was legally our son according to all the paperwork, but he was morally and biologically theirs. He had no memory of his life before age 3, which the adoption agency had explained as normal developmental amnesia that happens when children are removed from traumatic situations. Now I wondered if that early childhood amnesia had been somehow induced, or if he'd been too young to retain clear memories of his kidnapping. That evening, I sat down with Daniel and told him everything about the meeting. He listened in stunned silence, occasionally asking questions about the physical evidence and behavioral similarities. When I finished, he sat back in his chair and said quietly, "We have to call the police. This is kidnapping, human trafficking. We could go to prison if anyone thinks we were involved." But even as he said it, I could see the same conflict in his eyes that I was feeling. Oliver was our son in every way that mattered except biologically. We stayed up all night discussing our options and the potential consequences of each choice. We could report everything to police and risk having Oliver immediately removed from our home while an investigation proceeded. We could try to work something out privately with the Castellanos, though that felt legally dangerous and potentially unfair to everyone involved. We could hire lawyers and fight to keep Oliver, but that would mean forcing his biological parents to go through another traumatic court battle. Every option seemed to guarantee pain for someone we cared about. The next morning, I woke up early and found Oliver in the kitchen making himself cereal, humming the same tune I'd heard in Anthony's videos. I sat down beside him and asked if he remembered anything from when he was very little before he came to live with us. He looked thoughtful for a moment and said he sometimes had dreams about a big dog and a swing set in a backyard, but he thought those were just pretend dreams. Maria had mentioned that Vincent loved their golden retriever Max and spent hours on the swing set Anthony had built. I realized I had to make the call to police, not just for legal protection, but because Maria and Anthony deserved to know what happened to their child, and to have some kind of resolution after 2 years of anguish. I also needed to know how many other families might be in similar situations, how many other children might have been trafficked through agencies like Sunshine Family Services. This was bigger than just our family's crisis. Detective Raymond Shaw arrived at our house that afternoon with a child psychologist and a social worker from the county. I'd explained the situation over the phone, and they'd moved quickly to begin what they called a preliminary investigation. Oliver was at school, which gave us time to lay out all the evidence without him present. Detective Shaw looked through the photos, the missing child poster, and our adoption paperwork with growing concern. "This is the third case like this we've seen in the past 6 months," he said grimly. "We've been investigating a network of fraudulent adoption agencies that appear to be trafficking missing children to unsuspecting families. The agencies use legitimate-sounding names and provide convincing paperwork, but they're essentially laundering kidnapped kids through the adoption system." He explained that the families who adopt these children are usually completely innocent, believing they're providing homes for children who legitimately need them. The social worker, Janet Martinez, was gentle but direct about what would happen next. Oliver would need to be interviewed by specialists trained in recovered missing children cases, and there would have to be DNA testing to confirm his identity. Depending on the results, decisions would be made about custody and how to handle the transition process. She emphasized that everyone's goal was to minimize trauma for Oliver, while ensuring his safety and well-being. When Oliver came home from school, I sat him down in the living room with Daniel and tried to explain in age-appropriate terms that we'd discovered some important information about his family history. I told him that we might have found his birth parents, people who had been missing him very much, and that some adults needed to ask him questions to figure out what was best for everyone. Oliver looked confused and a little scared, asking if he was in trouble or if we didn't want him anymore. I hugged him tightly and assured him that nothing was his fault, and that we would always love him no matter what happened. Daniel added that sometimes grown-ups make mistakes with paperwork, and we needed help from other adults to fix those mistakes. Oliver seemed to accept this explanation, though he asked several times if he would have to leave our house. I told him honestly that I didn't know what would happen, but that everyone involved wanted to make sure he felt safe and loved. The next few days were a blur of interviews, medical examinations, and legal consultations. Oliver was remarkably resilient through the process, treating the meetings with specialists as if they were just unusual appointments, like going to the dentist. The child psychologist said this was common in cases involving very young children, who often adapt better to changing circumstances than adults expect. The DNA results came back within 48 hours, confirming what we all already knew. Oliver was indeed Vincent Castellano. Maria and Anthony were allowed to visit under supervised conditions while social services developed a transition plan. The first meeting was incredibly emotional, with Maria crying the moment she saw Oliver in person. He was polite but confused, clearly not recognizing them as anything more than friendly strangers. Anthony knelt down to Oliver's level and said softly, "We've been missing you for a very long time, buddy. We never stopped looking for you." Oliver responded by showing him a toy robot, as if meeting new adults was completely normal. Over several supervised visits, Oliver gradually warmed up to the Castellanos, though he still showed no signs of remembering his life before age 3. The child psychologist explained that this was typical for children who experience trauma or significant life changes at such a young age. She recommended a gradual transition process that would allow Oliver to maintain relationships with both families while slowly shifting his primary residence to his biological parents. The investigation into Sunshine Family Services revealed a sophisticated trafficking operation involving at least 12 missing children placed with families across 4 states. Detective Shaw said the agency had been operating for 3 years, using forged documents and bribed officials to create legitimate-looking adoptions. Patricia Valdez, the social worker who'd handled our case, had been arrested along with the agency's directors. The FBI was coordinating with local police to locate and recover other missing children who might be living with unknowing adoptive families. The most heartbreaking aspect of the investigation was discovering that all the adoptive families were genuine, loving parents who believed they were providing homes for children in need. None of us had any idea we were participating in human trafficking. The criminals had deliberately targeted couples struggling with infertility, knowing we'd be grateful and less likely to ask difficult questions about unusually fast adoption processes. We'd all been victims in different ways. 3 weeks after the DNA confirmation, we began the official transition process. Oliver would spend increasing amounts of time with the Castellanos, while maintaining regular contact with Daniel and me. The goal was to eventually return him to his biological family while preserving the relationships he'd formed with us. It was an unprecedented situation that required careful coordination between multiple agencies and mental health professionals. The first overnight visit was scheduled for a weekend, and I packed Oliver's favorite clothes and toys with shaking hands. He seemed excited about the adventure, asking if Maria's golden retriever Max would remember him and whether Anthony still had the swing set from his dreams. Maria had been telling him stories about their life together, showing him photo albums and videos that slowly started triggering vague memories, or at least familiar feelings. When they picked him up Friday evening, Oliver hugged me goodbye and said he'd see me soon, as if this was just another playdate. I watched their car disappear down the street and then collapsed on the couch, sobbing harder than I had since this whole nightmare began. Daniel held me while I grieved the loss of the child who'd been the center of our world for 2 years, even though I knew returning him to his biological family was the right thing to do. Oliver came back Sunday evening bubbling with excitement about his weekend. He'd remembered Max immediately when he saw the dog, and he'd spent hours on the swing set that Anthony had maintained exactly as it was when Vincent disappeared. He showed me a picture he'd drawn of the Castellano family's house and said it felt familiar in a way he couldn't explain. Maria had let him help make mac and cheese using Vincent's favorite recipe, and he'd slept in his original bedroom surrounded by toys that had been waiting for him. Over the following weeks, Oliver's stays with the Castellanos grew longer while his time with us decreased. Each transition was emotionally devastating for Daniel and me, but we could see that Oliver was genuinely happy and was starting to remember more details about his early life. He began calling Maria and Anthony by their first names, then gradually progressed to Mama Maria and Papa Anthony. The child psychologist said this was a healthy way of integrating his 2 families without forcing him to choose between them. The hardest conversation came when Oliver asked me directly if Maria and Anthony were his real parents, and if that meant Daniel and I weren't his real parents anymore. I sat him down and explained that families can be made in different ways, that Maria and Anthony were his birth parents who made him and loved him first, but that Daniel and I were also his parents because we'd raised him and loved him every day for 2 years. I told him that having more people who love you is always better than having fewer people who love you. 6 months after that first Facebook post, the custody transition was complete. Oliver was living full-time with the Castellanos, but we maintained regular visitation rights and continued to be part of his extended family. The legal system had worked out an arrangement that recognized both the biological family's rights and the emotional bonds Oliver had formed with us. It wasn't perfect, but it was the best solution anyone could devise for an impossible situation. The criminal case against Sunshine Family Services resulted in federal charges for human trafficking, conspiracy, and fraud. Patricia Valdez was sentenced to 15 years in prison, while the agency's directors received even longer sentences. The investigation led to the recovery of 7 other missing children who'd been placed with unsuspecting adoptive families, though not all of those cases had endings as positive as ours. Some children had been with their adoptive families for longer periods, making transitions more complicated and traumatic. Daniel and I started attending support group meetings for families affected by adoption fraud, which helped us process our grief and confusion about the experience. We met other couples who'd been through similar situations, and hearing their stories helped us understand that we weren't alone in feeling conflicted about loving a child who wasn't legally or biologically ours. The group taught us coping strategies for maintaining relationships with children during custody transitions and dealing with the complex emotions involved. A year later, Oliver calls us Aunt Jessica and Uncle Daniel, and we see him every other weekend plus holidays. He's thriving with the Castellanos, showing no signs of trauma from the transition process. His memories of his early life have largely returned, though he still sometimes confuses details from his time with us, with memories from before his kidnapping. The child psychologist says this is normal, and that his brain has successfully integrated both experiences into a coherent sense of self. Maria and Anthony have been incredibly gracious throughout this process, recognizing that Daniel and I genuinely love Oliver and provided him with excellent care during the years he was with us. They've included us in birthday parties and school events, creating an extended family structure that works for everyone involved. Oliver seems to accept this arrangement naturally, treating it as normal to have multiple sets of parents who all care about him. The investigation into the trafficking network revealed connections to similar operations across the country, leading to federal legislation requiring stricter oversight of adoption agencies and better coordination between missing children databases and adoption records. Our case became part of a larger effort to prevent other families from experiencing similar trauma through improved background checks and mandatory waiting periods for all private adoptions. Sometimes I wonder about the life Oliver would have had if he'd never been kidnapped, if he'd grown up with the Castellanos from the beginning. But I also know that the 2 years he spent with us were filled with love and stability, and that those experiences became part of who he is today. None of us chose this situation, but we all made the best decisions we could with the information available to us at each step of the process. The most important lesson I learned is that family can be defined in many different ways, and that love doesn't have to be diminished by sharing it with more people. Oliver has 2 sets of parents who adore him, and while the circumstances that created this arrangement were tragic and criminal, the result is a child who knows beyond any doubt that he is cherished by multiple adults who will always be there for him. 3 years after finding that Facebook post, I still think about all the missing children whose faces appear in social media feeds and on milk cartons. I wonder how many of them might be living with loving families who have no idea they're raising someone else's stolen child. Our story had a relatively happy ending, because everyone involved prioritized Oliver's well-being over their own desires. But I know that's not always the case in situations involving child trafficking and adoption fraud. The experience taught me that the systems we trust to protect children aren't always as secure as we assume, and that criminal organizations can exploit the good intentions of families hoping to adopt. It also showed me that even in the worst circumstances, people can choose to act with compassion and integrity, putting children's needs ahead of their own pain and loss. Oliver is thriving today because multiple adults were willing to make difficult sacrifices to ensure his safety and happiness. Daniel and I eventually decided not to pursue adoption again, partly because of the trauma from our experience with Oliver, and partly because we realized we weren't emotionally prepared to risk another heartbreaking situation. Instead, we channel our parental energy into volunteering with organizations that support missing children investigations and adoption fraud prevention. We want to help other families avoid going through what we experienced and to ensure that children like Oliver are returned to their rightful families as quickly as possible. The day I saw Oliver's face in that missing child database changed everything for everyone involved, but it also led to justice for his biological family and recovery for several other missing children. Sometimes the most difficult decisions lead to the best outcomes, even when those outcomes aren't what anyone initially expected or wanted. Love isn't about possession or legal ownership. It's about wanting what's best for the people you care about, even when that means letting them go.